The crowd buzzed with anticipation, the energy in the studio electric. Tonight wasn't just another episode of the late night show with Martin Fields. It was supposed to be a spectacle, a takedown. Martin had built his reputation on sharp wit and brutal honesty, never holding back, no matter who sat across from him. And tonight he had the perfect target, Donald J. Trump, the man who had been called everything from a genius to a villain, from a patriot to a tyrant. Martin had his questions sharpened like knives, ready to cut deep. The cameras rolled, the applause sign flashed, and then he walked in. Trump stepped onto the stage with his usual confidence, waving to the mixed reactions from the audience. Cheers, boos, it didn't matter. He had heard it all before. He took his seat, adjusting his cufflinks, his face unreadable. Martin leaned forward with a smirk, his first jab ready. "Mr. Trump, you're one of the most talked about men in the world. People say you're arrogant, heartless, even cruel. What do you say to that?" The crowd chuckled, waiting for Trump's usual bravado, his typical counterpunch. But instead, he did something no one expected. He went silent. For a moment, he just sat there, looking at Martin, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something softer, something real. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You know, Martin, people love to talk about the worst in others. It makes for good TV. But what if, for just one night, we talked about something else?" Martin frowned. "Like what?" Trump leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Kindness." The room shifted. The audience, expecting a battle, suddenly found themselves in a different moment, one that felt heavier, more important. Martin opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his career, he found himself at a loss for words. Because this wasn't the conversation he had prepared for, and he had no idea where it was about to go. A hush fell over the studio. The energy in the room had changed. What was supposed to be a spectacle of mockery had suddenly become something deeper, something real. Martin Fields, usually so quick with a joke or a snide remark, found himself caught off guard. He had expected Trump to fire back, to brag, to deflect. But instead, the former president sat there, calm and composed, talking about kindness. Martin chuckled, shaking his head. "Kindness? That's rich, coming from you." Trump didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands on the desk and met Martin's gaze. "You ever stop and wonder," he said, "why people only want to talk about the worst in others? Why we never ask about the good they've done?" Martin raised an eyebrow. "Is this your way of saying you're a saint?" Trump smirked, but shook his head. "Not at all. I've made mistakes, a lot of them. But I've also seen things most people haven't. I've met people whose lives were changed not by policies or politics, but by small moments of kindness." The audience was quiet now, listening. This was not the brash, larger-than-life persona they had expected. This was something else. Martin, determined to regain control, leaned forward. "All right, prove it. Tell me one time, just one, when you did something truly selfless." Trump exhaled, as if deciding whether to play along. And then, in a tone softer than anyone had ever heard from him, he said, "There was a little girl. Her name was Emily." The audience stirred. Martin hesitated. Trump continued. "She had a rare disease. Her parents wrote me a letter, desperate, hopeless. They had exhausted every option, every dollar. The treatment she needed was impossible to afford, and you know what I did?" Martin leaned in, despite himself. "What?" Trump looked straight into his eyes. "I paid for it. Every last penny." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Martin blinked, searching for sarcasm, for bravado, but there was none. "Why?" he asked. Trump shrugged. "Because I could, and because sometimes, Martin, you don't need a reason to help someone. You just do it." The audience was silent. No jokes, no jeers, just the weight of those words settling over the room. For the first time in his career, Martin Fields felt something unexpected. Respect. The silence in the studio was thick, the kind that made even the cameras seem to hesitate. The audience had expected a battle of wits, a clash of egos, but instead they were witnessing something rare. Honesty. Martin shifted in his chair, clearly thrown off. He had spent years exposing politicians, making them stumble. But Trump wasn't playing by the script. He wasn't fighting back with insults or bravado. He had answered with kindness, and Martin didn't know what to do with that. The host cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "All right, so you paid for a sick kid's treatment. That's a great story. But let's be real. One good deed doesn't erase everything else." Trump leaned back in his chair, nodding. "You're right, it doesn't." Martin blinked. He hadn't expected Trump to agree with him. "But that's not the point," Trump continued. "The point is that people never ask about these things. They don't want to hear about them. They want the scandal, the controversy, the drama." He gestured toward the audience. "It's what sells, right?" Martin frowned but didn't argue. It was true. His show thrived on controversy, on making people look foolish. It was what the audience came for. Trump's voice softened. "I'm not saying I'm perfect, Martin, far from it. But I've met people who changed my life just as much as I've changed theirs. People like Emily and her parents. People who reminded me that the world isn't just about power and money. It's about what you do with it." A murmur spread through the audience. This wasn't the Trump they had expected. Martin exhaled, drumming his fingers against the desk. He didn't want to admit it, but something about Trump's words was sticking, getting under his skin. Because deep down, Martin knew he had built his career on tearing people down, not lifting them up. And for the first time, he wondered if that was the easy way out. "So," Martin said slowly, "if kindness is so important to you, why don't we hear more about it?" Trump smirked. "Because you don't ask about it." The audience stirred, some nodding, others whispering. Martin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Trump folded his hands, his voice steady. "You know, Martin, if you really want to know who someone is, don't just look at their mistakes. Look at the people they've helped when no one was watching." The weight of those words settled over the studio. For the first time in his career, Martin Fields wasn't sure how to respond. Because for once, he wasn't the one teaching the lesson. He was the one learning it. The studio felt different now. The air was thick with something deeper than entertainment. Introspection. The audience, once eager for a spectacle, now sat in thoughtful silence. Even Martin, usually quick with a sharp retort, seemed caught off guard. He exhaled, shifting in his chair. "All right, I'll bite. You say people should ask about the good instead of just the bad. Fine. But let's be honest. People don't expect that from you. They see the businessman, the politician, the fighter, not the guy paying hospital bills in the background." Trump nodded, unfazed. "That's because people only see what they want to see." Martin narrowed his eyes. "Meaning?" Trump leaned forward slightly. "Meaning, people love their narratives. They need someone to root for, someone to blame. And the media, they feed that. They take a single moment, a single decision, and turn it into a person's entire identity." Martin arched an eyebrow. "And you think that's unfair?" Trump smirked. "I think it's incomplete." The audience murmured in agreement. Whether they liked Trump or not, they couldn't deny he had a point. People were complicated. No one was just one thing. Trump continued, his voice steady. "I don't expect everyone to like me, Martin. I don't even want that. But I do think it's a problem when people stop looking at the full picture. When they judge a man based on headlines instead of his actions. And that's not just about me, it's about everyone." Martin rubbed his chin, his usual bravado slipping. This was different from any interview he had done. He had come prepared to dismantle Trump, to expose flaws and contradictions. Instead, Trump was exposing him, forcing him to confront the way he shaped public perception. A thought nagged at the back of Martin's mind, something he had never admitted, even to himself. How many times had he torn someone down without really knowing who they were? How many times had he chosen the easy joke over the truth? He looked back at Trump, really looked at him, not as a headline, not as a persona, but as a man sitting across from him, speaking plainly. "So," Martin said slowly, "you really think kindness matters that much? Even in a world that rewards power and controversy?" Trump smiled, really smiled. "Martin, I don't just think it matters, I know it does." A beat of silence passed. And for the first time in his career, Martin Fields wasn't sure who had the upper hand. Because tonight, He wasn't leading the conversation. He was learning from it. The silence in the studio was unlike anything Martin had experienced before. It wasn't the awkward, uncomfortable kind that followed a joke that didn't land. It was something heavier, something real. He tapped his fingers against the desk, grasping for a way to regain control. But Trump's words lingered in the air, shifting the energy of the room in a way Martin hadn't expected. He exhaled sharply. "All right, let's say, for a moment, that you're right, that kindness matters, that people should look at the whole picture." He leaned forward, eyes locked onto Trump's. "Tell me then, what's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you?" The question seemed to catch Trump off guard. His usual quick-witted responses, his practiced confidence, just for a second they wavered. Then he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "You know, Martin, that's not a question I get asked a lot." Martin smirked. "That's the point." Trump nodded, the corner of his mouth tugging upward. But there was something in his eyes, something softer, distant, like he was reaching into a place few had ever seen. "When I was young," Trump began, "just starting out in business, I was ambitious. Too ambitious. I thought I could do everything myself. I didn't want to ask for help. I thought that meant weakness." Martin folded his arms. "And?" Trump's voice grew quieter. "And then my father pulled me aside one night after a deal had gone bad. I was furious, ready to blame everyone but myself, and he said something I'll never forget." The audience leaned in. Martin did too. Trump's eyes flickered with memory. "Never be too proud to accept help, son. No one builds anything alone." A hush fell over the room. Even the crew members, usually indifferent to celebrity interviews, seemed frozen in place. Trump exhaled. "It stuck with me. Because no matter how much success you have, no matter how powerful you think you are, there will always be a moment when you need someone. A moment when kindness, real kindness, can change everything." Martin sat back, his smirk fading. He had expected stories about business conquests, political victories, or maybe even self-praise. But this was different. He ran a hand through his hair. "So, you're saying you didn't get here alone?" Trump shook his head. "No one does, Martin. Not me, not you, not anyone." The audience, once eager to cheer or boo, now sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the fiery, combative Trump they had expected. This was a man reflecting, a man speaking from something deeper than politics or power. And for the first time in a long time, Martin Fields felt something unexpected. He felt challenged. The weight of Trump's words settled over the room, and for the first time, Martin Fields felt exposed. Not because he had been caught off guard, but because something inside him recognized the truth in what Trump was saying. He had built his career on being the man who didn't need anyone, the quick-witted host who tore through guests with sarcasm and wit, never flinching, never backing down. But now, across from him sat a man who was supposed to be an easy target. Yet, instead of fighting, he was teaching. Martin cleared his throat, trying to shake the feeling. "So, let's say I believe you," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "that no one makes it alone, that kindness, real kindness, can change everything. If that's the case, why don't we hear more about it from you?" Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Because, Martin, people don't want to hear about it." Martin frowned. "What do you mean?" Trump leaned forward. "You know as well as I do, kindness doesn't sell. Controversy does. If I say something that people can argue about, it's on every headline. But if I quietly help someone behind the scenes, no one cares, no one clicks. That's the world we live in." Martin had no response. He hated that Trump had a point. Trump continued, his voice steady. "I don't do things for praise, Martin. I do them because I believe in them. And I know, no matter what I say tonight, no matter how real this conversation is, by tomorrow, the headlines will twist it into something else." He smirked, shaking his head. "That's just how it works." Martin stared at him, something tightening in his chest. It was the first time he had ever seen Trump not just as a public figure, not just as a politician, but as a person. The man across from him wasn't just defending his legacy. He was revealing something Martin hadn't expected. Trump wasn't bothered by the way the media painted him. He had accepted it. He had lived with it. And yet, despite everything, he still believed in kindness. Martin swallowed hard, gripping his pen a little tighter. So, if no one ever hears about it, why keep doing it? Trump's smile faded slightly. His answer was quiet but firm. Because it's the right thing to do. Silence. No cameras flashing, no audience shouting. Just those words hanging in the air, heavier than anything Martin had expected to hear tonight. For the first time in his career, Martin Fields realized he had walked into this interview thinking he knew his guest. But now, he wasn't sure he knew himself. The studio had never been this quiet before. Martin Fields, the man who prided himself on controlling every conversation, suddenly felt like he was the one being interviewed. The man sitting across from him wasn't the easy target he had expected. Trump wasn't flustered, he wasn't defensive. He was calm, unwavering, and, worst of all, right. Martin licked his lips, struggling to find his footing again. So, if kindness matters so much to you, why not make it your message? Why not prove to people that you're more than the controversy? Trump chuckled, shaking his head. Martin, you're missing the point. It's not about proving anything. When you do something kind, it's not about getting credit. It's about making a difference, whether people see it or not. Martin exhaled sharply. That sounds great in theory, but let's be honest. People believe what they're told, and you haven't exactly had the best image when it comes to compassion. Trump tilted his head slightly, considering the statement. And whose fault is that? Martin blinked. What? Trump's voice remained steady. I can't control what people believe. I can't control how the media spins things. But I can control my actions. And I can live with the fact that at the end of the day, I've done more for people than most of my critics ever will. The words hit harder than Martin expected. Trump continued. The real question, Martin, isn't why people don't see kindness in me. It's why they don't want to see it. A murmur rippled through the audience. Martin leaned back, rubbing his fingers together. You're saying people want to believe the worst? Trump shrugged. It's easier, isn't it? It's easier to put people in a box, to label them, than to admit they're complicated, that they've done both good and bad. Martin swallowed hard. He had spent years painting his guests into corners, pushing them into narratives that made for good television. He never thought about what that did to them as people. Trump leaned forward. You know, Martin, for someone who built a career exposing the truth, you seem afraid to face your own. The air in the room changed again. This time, the weight was on Martin's shoulders. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he was asking the tough questions, or if he was finally the one who needed to answer them. Martin felt his throat tighten. The tables had turned completely, and he knew it. The man he had expected to humiliate, to reduce to sound bites and easy punchlines, was instead exposing something deeper, something Martin hadn't been prepared to face. Trump wasn't trying to win an argument. He wasn't even trying to change anyone's mind. He was simply telling the truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. And that truth wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. Martin shifted in his chair, forcing himself to push forward. All right, he said, his voice quieter now. Let's say you're right. Let's say people only see what they want to see. How do you change that? Trump sighed, leaning back. You don't. Martin frowned. What do you mean? Trump met his gaze, unwavering. You don't change people by arguing with them, Martin. You change them by showing them. The audience sat in absolute silence. Trump continued, his voice steady. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to respect me. But if you look past the noise, past the headlines, past the late-night jokes, you'll see what I've built, the people I've helped, the lives I've changed. And if that doesn't matter to you, that's not my problem. That's yours. Martin swallowed. He had spent his whole career asking tough questions, forcing people into corners, stripping away their defenses. But right now, in this moment, he realized something. For the first time, he was the one being stripped down. And the truth staring back at him was simple. He had spent so much time tearing others apart, he had never stopped to ask himself why. Martin sat back in his chair, staring at Trump, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had invited Trump here to make him look small. Instead, he had walked into something far bigger than he had ever expected. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to say next. And for the first time, he realized maybe, just maybe, he had been asking the wrong questions all along. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Martin Fields, the man who always had a punchline, a quick comeback, or a biting remark, found himself staring across the desk, unsure of what to say next. And for the first time, he realized maybe, just maybe, he had been asking the wrong questions all along. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Martin Fields, the man who always had a punchline, a quick comeback, or a biting remark, found himself staring across the desk, unsure of what to say next. Trump hadn't fought him. He hadn't stormed off, thrown insults, or played into the spectacle Martin had set up. He had done something far more disarming. He had spoken with conviction. Martin shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at the audience. Their expressions mirrored his own, caught somewhere between surprise and reflection. This wasn't the show they had come for, but it was something real. He exhaled slowly. "I have to admit, Mr. Trump, I didn't expect this conversation to go the way it has." Trump smirked. "That makes two of us." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, but the energy was different now. Less like a performance, more like a moment of honesty. Martin leaned forward. "You've spent years being criticized, ridiculed, even hated, and yet you sit here saying you believe in kindness, in doing the right thing even when no one sees it. I have to ask, does it ever get to you?" For the first time that night, Trump hesitated. His smirk faded just slightly and something more vulnerable flickered across his face, so quick that Martin almost missed it. "Of course it does," Trump admitted. "I'm human, Martin. People like to pretend I don't have feelings, that I don't care. But let me tell you something. No one goes through life completely untouched by what's said about them." Martin swallowed. "Then why keep going?" Trump exhaled, his voice softer now. "Because I believe in what I'm doing. Because I know that no matter what people say, I've helped more people than they'll ever realize. And because I don't live for their approval." Martin's chest tightened. He had spent years dissecting people, putting them on trial with his words. But tonight, he wasn't sitting across from the villain the media had built up. He was sitting across from a man, flawed, complex, but real. Trump continued, his gaze unwavering. "People will always talk, Martin. They'll always judge. But at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what you know in your heart to be true." Martin looked down at his hands. For years, he had prided himself on being the man who exposed others. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been missing something all along. When he finally looked back up, there was no smugness left in his expression, just quiet understanding. "Maybe," Martin said slowly, "we all need to start asking different questions." Trump nodded. "Maybe we do." And with that, the audience, silent for what felt like an eternity, broke into applause. Not the forced, scripted applause of late-night television, but the kind that came when people knew they had just witnessed something real. The applause rippled through the studio, but it wasn't the usual rowdy cheer of entertainment. It was softer, more thoughtful, like the audience themselves weren't sure how to process what they had just witnessed. Martin Fields, the man who had built his career on breaking people down, sat across from a man he had expected to humiliate, and instead, he had been changed by the conversation. Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "You know, Martin," he said, his voice steady, "the world doesn't need more people looking to tear others down. It needs people willing to understand each other, to listen." Martin exhaled, gripping the edge of his desk. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were the truth. Trump smirked. "I usually am." A small laugh spread through the audience. The tension that had once hung so thickly in the air had shifted, now replaced by something lighter, something almost hopeful. As the show wrapped up, Martin looked out at the crowd, then back at Trump. He had come into this interview expecting one thing and walked away with something entirely different. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson in all of this. That people weren't as simple as the world made them out to be. That everyone had a story worth listening to. That kindness wasn't weakness, but strength. As the credits rolled and the show ended, Martin sat there, still processing what had just happened. Because for the first time in his career, he hadn't just been the interviewer, he had been changed. In a world obsessed with tearing people down, be someone who lifts others up. Look past the headlines, past the labels, past the noise. Take the time to listen, to understand, to see the full picture. Because at the end of the day, the legacy we leave isn't in how we judge others, but in how we treat them,